Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Halo para pembelajar semuanya, dulur-dulurku tercinta. Semoga dalam kondisi sehat walafiat tanpa kurang sesuatu apapun. Nah, dulur-dulurku semuanya, mungkin banyak ya yang memang belum tahu banyak yang belum tahu dari kecanggihan negeri ini, Sakura Jepang, mengenai teknologinya dan juga segala macam masa lalunya. Ada hal menarik yang gue temui dalam hal ini di suatu film dokumenter yang dibuat oleh seorang yang ada di sana yang tahu persis mengenai data dan sejarah mengenai banyak orang-orang kaya di Jepang sana yang memang berangkat dari sisi kegelapannya, entah dari gangster, entah dari mafianya, yakuzanya, dan seterusnya, dan sejenis itulah. Nah, tanpa banyak basa-basi lagi, perjalanan mereka ini sangat menarik untuk disimak. Untuk mempersingkat waktu, yuk coba kita lihat apa yang disuguhkan dalam dokumenter menarik ini. Simak sampai selesai biar lu tambah pengetahuan tentunya ya lu ya. Bagi yang baru bergabung, jangan lupa subscribe channel ini agar lu gak ketinggalan dari info-info menarik yang bisa lu dapatkan.
Nicholas Zapetti was born in East Harlem, New York in 1921. He had a total of 10 siblings, and his father, a carpenter who came to New York from the southern Italian region of Calabria, was barely able to both pay the rent as well as keep him and his family from starving. Nick himself was exposed to criminal activities and the mafia at a young age. His neighbor was a professional hitman, and his family's long list of friends and distant relatives allegedly included names such as Tommy Lucchese, Joey Rayo, and Mike Coppola, who would all go on to be famous mobsters in their own right. When World War II came around, Nick Zapetti, now in his 20s, was convinced that it would be his way out of the miserable life that he had to endure in East Harlem. In late August of 1945, not long before Japan officially surrendered, Nick joined the US Marine Corps. He would spend his time at Omura Air Base in Nagasaki before taking one of 6,000 jobs inside the General Headquarters, or GHQ, of the American occupation government in Tokyo. The capital of Japan at that point was pretty much unrecognizable from the city that stood on the same ground just a few years earlier. Out of the 1.6 million buildings that were once located in Tokyo, around 1 million were now reduced to nothing but ashes by the countless fire raids that took place during the war. Tokyo's citizens were poor, homeless, and starving, with everything that a person needs in order to survive in short supply, especially food. Before the American occupation forces could even set up shop in Tokyo, the first black markets started popping up all over the city, selling things like tea, rice, and even military equipment which was no longer needed. Nick Zapetti saw the black markets as a financial opportunity very early on. In early 1947, he went back to the United States and returned to Japan with several thousand lighter flints, a very desirable item on the Tokyo black markets that made Zapetti a hefty sum of money. By March of 1948, Nick was married to a Japanese woman and was successfully selling beer to black markets, made possible by his connections inside the occupation headquarters and by bribing the local beer brewers. The money made from this venture allowed Zapetti to buy a plot of land and build a house for his wife and 2 infant children. By 1950, however, Nick's beer operation caught the eye of undercover detectives, ultimately leading to his first arrest and subsequent deportation back to New York. Zapetti, though, quite enjoyed his life in Tokyo and decided that he had to go back, no matter what. Problem was, his passport was seized when he returned to the US, and even if he did manage to get it back somehow, there was no way that the GHQ back in Tokyo would allow a criminal to enter the country, except for the fact that they would do exactly that, with a little help from the American mafia. A distant relative of Nick and member of the mob told him that he would take care of Nick's problem. All he had to do was fill out an application for a new passport, as well as one for a Japanese visa. A few weeks after bringing the necessary paperwork to an accomplice inside the mayor's office, Zapetti received a shiny new passport in the mail. Problem number 1 solved. Problem number 2, namely the visa for actually entering Japan, was solved by a guy named Bob, a former quote-unquote business partner of Zapetti inside the occupation offices in Tokyo. The list of people requesting to enter Japan went through Bob's hands, meaning that a simple checkmark missing next to Nick's name would make his dream of returning to Japan come true. And so it did. In June of 1950, Zapetti returned to Japan. His wife had long since lost interest in Nick and moved somewhere else. Nick, seemingly unfazed, started working on his next big business venture, which would take him to new heights financially. With the help of a few bribes here and there, he was able to get his hands on a permit to sell goods to military personnel. Then, along with a few friends, he set up a company under the name Lance Co. The company did actually sell goods to military personnel. However, this was only a front for what was really going on behind the scenes of Lance Co. The real money started rolling in when Zapetti and his company started selling dollar checks on the black market, raking in large sums of money in the process. American and Canadian companies in Japan were not happy with the dollar to yen exchange rate, which was fixed at 360 yen per dollar in 1949. Lance Co. would buy the company's dollar checks at a rate of 420 yen to the dollar and was then able to sell them on the black market, where US dollars were highly sought after, for 480 to 520 yen per dollar. We are talking checks upwards of $100,000 a piece, meaning that Lance Co. made an absolute killing by selling them. Zapetti also set up a fake bank called the Bank of Texas, which literally only existed on paper. By printing out a few convincing but fake documents and creating a set of checkbooks, Zapetti was able to write checks which he would then sell to people in the underworld. The fake checks would usually go through multiple buyers before someone actually tried to cash it, finding out that the check was actually worth nothing. By then, tracing it back to Zapetti was pretty much impossible. The American occupation of Japan officially ended on April 28, 1952. Lance Co., maybe surprisingly so, actually managed to stay in business by mixing their most dubious ventures with the sale of products like stolen spaghetti, of which they allegedly managed to sell 4,000 pounds in one magical afternoon. Rigged slot machines installed in a hotel frequented by American GIs also pulled endless amounts of cash out of the gamblers' pockets. The amount of money that Lance Co. was making was nothing to be sneezed at, with hundreds of thousands of dollars finding their way into the two-story office in Ginza, a district of Tokyo famous for its iconic clock tower and home to Japan's very first sidewalks. Things were going great for Zapetti and his buddies, until a raid on their office took place in 1953. One afternoon, an American criminal investigator, accompanied by a few Japanese policemen, showed up at Lance Co.'s doorstep. The investigator left the Lance Co. offices with all their cash confiscated as quote-unquote evidence. Not long after the raid, two of Zapetti's Russian business partners left for Moscow, while the third partner, an Australian, decided to open his own English school. With the gang split up and no cash left, Lance Co. was dead, but Nick would soon find another source of income in a completely different business: professional wrestling. In 1954, a tag team fight between two Japanese and two American fighters was broadcast live on Japanese television. When the Japanese fighters actually managed to defeat the Americans, who held the title of World Tag Team Champions at the time, it was a huge boost of pride and confidence for a nation that still had the defeat during World War II weighing heavily on their minds. It also turned one of the two Japanese fighters, the ex-sumo wrestler Rikido-san, into what was perhaps Japan's first post-war national hero. Rikido-san's crazy life story might actually deserve its own video, so let me know if that's something you'd like to see on the channel at some point. The fight, its cultural impact, and the subsequent pro wrestling craze that swept across Japan also presented an opportunity for Americans in the country looking to make some easy cash. Smaller pro wrestling event organizers, who couldn't exactly afford to hire superstars from overseas, resorted to hiring regular gaijins from the street who were ready to get their asses kicked for a cool $500 per fight. That's as much money as a Japanese factory worker earned at the time, per year. Of course, our main character Nick Zapetti jumped on the opportunity to lose in the ring for that kind of money, with his shady company having gone down the drain and nothing else to do. Nick managed to make a living off pro wrestling for a while, but ultimately he wasn't really the type of guy that the Japanese crowd wanted to see defeated in the ring. At 5'9" or 175 centimeters for all my metric homies out there, he simply wasn't massive enough. A guy who was massive enough and quite successful in the early days of Japanese pro wrestling was an ex-Marine named Sean McFarland, nicknamed Gorgeous Mac. But even with all the success that McFarland was able to find in the pro wrestling scene and all the money he made from it, he still managed to be broke somehow. Not to mention his 1 million yen bill at Tokyo's Imperial Hotel that hadn't been paid in weeks. In 1956, with no one else to turn to with his financial problems, he asked Nick Zapetti to come up with a plan to make a quick buck. And come up with a plan he did. The Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, considered the finest hotel in Asia at the time, featured a shop that sold diamonds to customers. Included was a special service which saw gemstones presented to guests in their hotel rooms. Zapetti came up with an elaborate and stealthy plan using knockout drops in a shop representative's drink, who would bring the gemstones to McFarland's room. What actually ended up happening was McFarland, nicknamed Gorgeous Mac instead of Subtle Mac for a reason, knocking the guy out and throwing him in the bathtub before leaving the hotel through the front door. McFarland actually managed to sell the gems, but was caught by the police shortly after. I mean, finding a 6'4" or 193cm tall American in Tokyo in 1956 isn't exactly a challenge, is it? Zapetti was also arrested soon after and had to endure, among other things, 8 hours of questioning per day. However, he would not give in to the interrogators and was rewarded with a deal that saw him receive a mere 8 months in prison and an $800 fine. Most importantly though, he would not be deported to the US, which could almost be considered a miracle in its own right. Gorgeous Mac, meanwhile, cracked immediately and received an 8-year prison sentence. By February of 1956, Nick Zapetti was a free man once again. Free, but completely broke. With no dollar or yen left in his pockets, Zapetti moved into an abandoned Turkish bathhouse, which had neither electricity nor water. It was here that he would come up with a plan that would earn him the title, the King of Roppongi. Zapetti, who had been living in Japan for more than a decade at this point, did not miss his hometown of New York that much. However, Tokyo in the 1950s was not exactly a hotspot for international cuisine. Sure, you could find French food or an American steakhouse if you were lucky, but what Nick was craving was Italian food, pizza in particular. Sitting in the abandoned bathhouse that he now called his home with an empty stomach, he dreamed about the potential of a restaurant with an Italian menu in Japan. It was decided Nick Zapetti would enter the restaurant business. But how? Without any money and no experience. In the evening, he would read books on Italian cooking. During the day, he tried to find investors. Miraculously, he managed to gather the 800,000 yen that he needed in order to start his business, provided by 10 different investors. As for the location of his restaurant, he already had one specific part of Tokyo in mind. Roppongi, located in the southwest of Tokyo and home to US Army barracks as well as a number of foreign businesses and diplomats. A quiet little place that would become one of the busiest places in the entire world and Tokyo's biggest hub for foreign visitors. Nick eventually found a spot he liked, a 2-story building owned by a Chinese tailor, who was ready to give Nick the first floor of the building. He redecorated the place to make it look more Italian, put in a jukebox and hired a girl from Tokyo Business School as a cashier, while the cooking, dishwashing, accounting and shopping was Nick's job. The restaurant, called Nicolas, quickly gained new customers, especially American military personnel. By the end of the 50s, at a time when the Japanese economy started gaining some serious traction, Nicolas became the talk of the town. For foreign customers, Zapetti's place was a chance to get a taste of home. For the Japanese, it was something completely new and exciting. Nowadays, you can find a pizza spot everywhere in Japan, but Nicolas was actually the first pizza restaurant in all of Japan. The clientele that Nicolas was able to attract might be the most interesting collection of people that a restaurant in Tokyo has ever had. Besides international and local people from all walks of life, the rich and famous also made themselves comfortable in Nick Zapetti's humble little restaurant. Among them celebrities like the legendary American actor John Wayne, who was in Tokyo at the time to film The Barbarian and the Geisha. The Crown Prince of Japan, Akihito, who was a curious young fella who traveled the world, reportedly was a frequent guest at Nicolas, even bringing his future wife Michiko along to enjoy a good slice of pizza. Another guest that has to be mentioned alongside these famous and royal VIPs is a man by the name of Machi Hisayuki. a Korean-born gangster and boss of the Tosei Kai Yakuza gang, which had just won a hard-fought battle against the mighty Sumiyoshi Kai gang over control of the aforementioned Ginza district, gaining control over countless bars, cabarets, and pachinko parlors, and with it new members, influence, and money. Lee Kido-san, the aforementioned ex-sumo wrestler turned national hero, also became a regular of Nicolas and had ties to both Machi and the Tosei Kai, who allegedly promoted many of his fights. Nick actually had a bit of a history with the Tosei Kai himself, which dates back to the early black market days. Back then, he somehow ended up with a truckload of gumballs that he desperately was trying to sell to vendors. And no, gumball is not a slang term for some kind of drug. We are talking about actual candy here. The vendors were not interested in Nick's gumballs in the slightest, until a few Tosei Kai foot soldiers hired by Zapetti stepped in to personally take care of the problem. Soon after, Nick's phone was ringing day and night, with countless vendors inquiring about his revolutionary new candy. Now, as the owner of a successful restaurant in a part of Tokyo that would be incredibly competitive in a few years' time, Zapetti learned how to use Tokyo's underworld to his advantage like no other American at the time. In 1959, a problem arose that saw one of Nick's business partners attempt to take over a branch restaurant in front of Yokota Air Base, all with the help of a few gangsters from the area. Nick spoke to Rikido-san about it, Rikido-san contacted Machi, and by 10 AM the next morning, the problem was taken care of. Around the same time, a new place called Club 88 opened its doors to visitors, not far from Nick's restaurant. Much to his annoyance, the club that offered live entertainment and hostesses also had pizza on their menu. One day, Zapetti, along with Rikido-san and one of his friends who presumably was a gangster, staged a fight in Club 88 and wrecked the whole place in the process. Soon after, Club 88 left the neighborhood, and Nicolas was once again the only pizza spot in Roppongi. In the early 1960s, when the Tosei Kai started gaining a serious foothold in Roppongi, Nicolas became somewhat of an unofficial headquarters of the gang, further strengthening the bond that Zapetti had to the Yakuza, who now controlled much of Tokyo's entertainment business. It was also Nick who urged Machi to get into the restaurant business. A great piece of advice, considering that only a few years later, the Tosei Kai boss owned several fancy restaurants, one of which he opened in partnership with Kodama Yoshio, one of Japan's most powerful men at the time. By the mid-1960s, Zapetti, now known as the King of Roppongi, owned 3 successful restaurants across Tokyo and had become the wealthiest foreigner in Japan by a long shot. All while other foreign businesses, except for some of the biggest of them all, were struggling to gain traction in the fast-growing Japanese economy. Nick seemed invincible at this point, but the king was not without his faults. A troubled love life coupled with a few bad business and life decisions would be enough to send Zapetti on a downward spiral that would keep him trapped for the rest of his life. At his financial peak, the King of Roppongi owned several houses across Japan and Hawaii, financed by multiple restaurant branches which were raking in a healthy amount of cash. According to his own calculations, which you can believe or not, he would have been worth more than $1 billion. Would he have been able to keep everything that he once owned? $1 billion is a wild number, but considering how expensive property in Roppongi had become by 1990, his calculations are not completely unrealistic. A few key decisions would lead to Nick's business empire eventually falling apart. Like that one time when he tried to get into the fashion industry by selling mink coats, which saw him set up a whole mink farm that ultimately failed, costing him upwards of 200 million yen. He also imported frozen rabbit skins at one point and handed large sums of money to people who he knew would never be able to pay him back. Nick's love life also played a huge part in his eventual downfall. In total, Zapetti got married 4 times. His first wife, who he had married in 1947, had custody over their 2 children. In 1964, he married Yae, a young cashier at one of his restaurants, who would remain an integral part of the company for the rest of Nick's life, even after he divorced her in 1968 in order to marry his 3rd wife, a beauty pageant queen from Hokkaido called Miyoko. His 3rd marriage lasted until 1972, and in 1975, Nick and Yae got married for the 2nd time. However, it was the divorce from Yae in 1968 that led to a series of events that would cost Zapetti an absolute fortune and his health. Taxes related to a transfer of property from Nick to Yae, which was part of the divorce settlement, would cost Zapetti around 23 million yen. Couple that with a slew of other bills and loans that he had to pay off due to his failed business ventures, and Nick was in big financial trouble, even with a restaurant business that was still going strong at that point. To pay it all off, Nick turned to moneylenders, who attached huge sums of interest to their loans. We are talking 30% interest per year going to one lender, 5% every 10 days going to another. By 1971, Nick owed the moneylenders a total of 160 million yen. Then, a company called Nihon Kotsu, the biggest taxi company in Tokyo, caught wind of Nick's financial troubles. They made him an offer that he could have, and probably should have, refused. They would loan Nick the 160 million that he owed with fair interest rates, on top of another 63 million yen loan, as requested by Zapetti himself. In turn, Nicolas and Nihon Kotsu would enter into a partnership, which saw the taxi company take 70% of the profits. The most notable part of the deal, however, was that Nick's flagship Roppongi restaurant would serve as a collateral, should Nick be unable to pay back the loan. Even against the advice of his business-savvy ex-wife Yae, Nick accepted the deal and signed the necessary paperwork. Not long after the deal was signed, Nihon Kotsu changed their mind and ended the partnership. All they wanted from Nick now was to get back their 223 million yen loan. To no one's surprise, Nick was not able to pay them back before the deadline. One day, upon entering his main restaurant, he was greeted by a group of around 15 tough-looking guys, occupying the main floor. Nick himself later speculated that these men were members of none other than the Sumiyoshi Kai, the Tosei Kai's biggest rivals since the end of the war. Whoever these men were, they were being directed by a Nihon Kotsu representative, who informed Nick that they took over the business as a result of his failed loan repayment. Not only did Nihon Kotsu confiscate Nick's most prized asset, they didn't even allow him to run the business anymore. Nick was furious and did something that generally the Japanese tried to avoid as much as possible. He filed a lawsuit claiming that the collateral that they agreed upon was merely the land and the building, not the business itself. Safe to say, Nihon Kotsu disagreed, and what followed was a slow, complicated lawsuit that took 2 years to put its first witness on the stand, and more than 15 years to reach a final settlement. At the same time, a shift in power was on the horizon, with the Sumiyoshi Kai slowly becoming the dominant gang in Roppongi, which was at the time still largely under the control of Machi Hisayuki's Tosei Kai. Zapetti at this point probably didn't care too much about which gang controlled Roppongi at the time. Besides being involved in a string of additional lawsuits, he was also attempting something that many people thought would be completely out of the realm of possibility for him: becoming a naturalized citizen of Japan. To understand why Zapetti becoming a Japanese citizen seemed impossible, there are two things in particular that you need to know about the guy. He got in trouble with the police more than a couple of times, meaning his police file was unusually thick, which in itself should have been enough to prevent Nick from becoming a Japanese citizen. In addition, even after more than 3 decades in Japan, the guy could barely string together a sentence in Japanese, let alone read properly, which are some of the main requirements for, you know, becoming a citizen of Japan. It's maybe because of these and a few other reasons that Zapetti's eventual success in applying for Japanese citizenship seems to perplex people, even today. According to my main source, he managed to become a naturalized citizen of Japan through a mix of connections to a powerful lawyer, as well as some classic Zapetti trickery. The lawyer in question also represented none other than Nakazone Yasuhiro, the future Prime Minister of Japan.
Ya, dulu semuanya begitulah kisah akhir kisah tragis dari seorang pebisnis di Jepang yang memang dimulai dari kisah gangsternya dan juga jejak track record hitamnya dan malang melintang di dunia usaha di Tokyo yang menghadapi berbagai macam masalah hukum yang akhirnya menikmatinya dengan tragis. Mungkin ada hikmah di balik ini bagi beberapa orang di antara kita yang memulai usaha dengan cara yang memang nggak lurus-lurus aja, ya pasti ada sesuatu yang harus dibayar mahal. Gimana tanggapannya dengan kisah ironis ini? Silakan jika ada yang ingin memberikan komentar atau menambahkan informasi. Semoga postingan kali ini bermanfaat dan sampai jumpa kembali di postingan berikutnya. Jangan lupa subscribe agar kita berjumpa kembali di postingan berikutnya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi
The lawyer allegedly managed to put together a special language test just for Zapetti, which saw him identify family names written on business cards, something that Nick actually was able to do pretty well. And sure enough, he passed the test. In 1981 or in 1983, depending on which source you ask, he changed his name from Nicholas Vincent Zapetti to Nicholas Koizumi, taking the last name of his wife, Koizumi Yae. By the late 1980s, the Japanese economy was at its absolute peak. The whole country regained its confidence and was once again a global superpower, even more so than ever before. With the economy booming and Japanese companies competing with the biggest in the world, times for foreigners in Japan were changing rapidly. After the end of World War II, a certain sense of supremacy over the defeated, starving population of Japan could be found among many Westerners, either occupying or visiting the land of the rising sun. But now, less than 50 years later, it was the Westerners who could no longer afford to live in the pricey neighborhoods of Tokyo. Nick Zapetti, or Koizumi as he was now called, was still involved in multiple legal cases that took a toll on his health, causing one heart attack that almost killed him. He also developed a profound hatred for the new, confident nation of Japan that he now resided in. Quote, "When we came here in 1945, we came to help them. We were generous to them. We paid for their goddamn defense. Now, they're buying us out and making us second-class citizens." Pretty ironic, coming from the mouth of an actual Japanese citizen. The Nihon Kotsu case, much to his dismay, ended in a 500 million yen settlement, which was used mainly to cover legal costs for several other lawsuits that he had going on at the time. Meanwhile, his health was declining rapidly. He was blind in one eye, suffered from diabetes, and required a cane in order to walk. In January of 1992, Nick sold his last remaining Nicholas branch, used the money to pay off his staff, gave some of it to his children, and kept the rest for himself, ready to retire. His first post-retirement move was supposed to be a quest for revenge. He had allegedly planned, or at least fantasized about, hiring professional hitmen, preferably members of the Italian mafia, who were supposed to take out anyone that caused him trouble during his final years. True or not, this plan thankfully never came to fruition. On June 10, 1992, Nick Koizumi passed away at the age of 71. His criminal file was transferred to the inactive section of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, a file which, according to a policeman, was the biggest criminal file that an American had ever accumulated in their department. While Nicholas isn't the talk of the town and home to celebrity guests nowadays, it does actually still exist. A total of 3 branches spread across Tokyo carry on the legacy of Nick Zapetti, the king of Roppongi, who, for all his faults as a person, at least managed to make a culinary impact on the land of the rising sun, while also providing us with a pretty rare, intriguing, and unusual story of a foreigner who managed to grab a piece of the pie that was the post-war economy of Japan.